The day Wesley Hartwell rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, 3 men stepped off the boardwalk to give him room, and not a single one of them was ashamed of doing it. He came in from the south, dust-coated and unhurried, his gray horse moving at a walk that somehow still managed to feel like a warning. He wore a plain black hat pulled low against the afternoon glare, and his coat was the color of dried sage. He carried a colt on his right hip, the way other men carried their names, as if it had always been there, as if it were simply a part of the anatomy he had been born with. Nobody in Caldwell had personally witnessed Wesley Hartwell draw that gun, but the stories had arrived 2 weeks before he did, riding ahead of him like outriders, and stories in a cattle town like this one had a way of settling into the soil. He had faced down the Drover brothers outside of Dodge City, and 2 of the 3 had not walked away. He had tracked a gang of horse thieves across the Cimarron River and returned every stolen animal without a scratch. He had spent 2 years riding as a hired gun for a ranch consortium down in the Texas Panhandle, and the consortium's enemies had one by one decided to find other pursuits. He was 32 years old. He had gray at his temples and a scar that ran from his jaw to just below his left ear, thin and pale as a river on a map. And he was, by the general consensus of everyone who had heard of him and the nervous consensus of everyone who had met him, the most dangerous man in the county. He took a room above the Caldwell Hardware and Sundry, paid a month in advance, and said very little to anyone for the first 3 days. Opal Keene heard about him on the second day, the way everyone in a small prairie town hears about everything, over the counter of the general store, between the exchange of coin and the wrapping of calico, in the murmured observation of women who had learned to catalog danger the way they cataloged weather patterns, because both could destroy everything you had built with no particular malice and no particular warning. "That is Wesley Hartwell boarding up there," said Mabel Doss, who ran the millinery next door to Opal's dry goods store and made it her business to know every piece of information that passed through Caldwell before it had fully decided what it was. "They say he killed 6 men. I heard it was 4, said Opal, measuring out dried beans with the kind of precision that came from years of making every ounce count. "Well, however many it was, they are all dead and he is not, and that tells you what you need to know." Opal said nothing to that, because she had learned that silence was usually the wisest response to Mabel Doss, and also because her son had just come through the front door with mud on his boots and a look on his face that meant he had been somewhere he had promised not to be. Her son was named Eli. He was 8 years old, sharp-eyed and quick, with a mop of dark hair that never stayed combed and a habit of asking questions that had no easy answers. He had his father's chin and Opal's stubbornness, and an imagination that regularly outpaced his good judgment. He was to Opal both the best thing in her world and the most exhausting thing she could have possibly undertaken, and she loved him so completely that it sometimes felt like a physical pressure in her chest. His father, Thomas Keene, had died of a fever 2 winters ago, just before Eli's 6th birthday. It had come on fast and taken him in 4 days, which was just enough time for Opal to understand that it was serious and not nearly enough time to make her peace with it. She had buried him in the small cemetery east of town with the red dirt earth frozen hard beneath the January sky, and she had walked back to the store that was now entirely hers, and she had kept going. Because that was what you did. Because Eli needed her to, and because the mortgage on the store would not care about her grief, and because she was 28 years old and still standing, and the standing had to count for something. That had been 2 years ago. She was 30 now. The store was doing well enough. Eli was doing well enough. She was doing well enough. She told herself this regularly, and on most days it was true, and on some nights it was true, and on the nights when it was not true she let herself feel it and then she put it away and went to sleep, because she had learned that grief is not a problem you solve but a weather pattern you learn to live inside of. She had not thought about another man in any romantic sense since Thomas died, had not felt the particular pull of wanting and being wanted, had not considered it a loss exactly because she had not had the space or the energy or the inclination to consider it at all. She was busy. She was managing. She was fine. And then her son, who had been somewhere he was not supposed to be, came in with mud on his boots and said, "Mama, I talked to the man with the gray horse." Opal set down the scoop of beans very carefully. "Did you?" she said. "He was sitting on the steps of the hardware store carving something with a knife," Eli said, dropping his hat on the counter with the confidence of a person who did not realize that hats belonged on the hook by the door. "I watched him for a while and then I asked him what he was making and he said he was whittling a sparrow. Eli. He was real polite about it, Mama. He said good afternoon and everything." "He is a dangerous man," Opal said, and she was aware as she said it that it sounded almost exactly like something Mabel Doss would say, which bothered her. "He did not seem dangerous," Eli said, with the infuriating logic of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to be afraid of the right things. "He seemed like he was just carving a bird. I asked him if he would teach me to whittle, and he said yes." Opal looked at her son for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the store window and caught the dust in the air and made the whole scene look, for just a second, like something from a painting. "He said yes," she repeated. "Tomorrow morning, if it was all right with you." "He said I should ask you first. He said he would not do it if you had an objection." Eli paused. "Do you have an objection?" She had about 17 objections, and she was sorting through them to find the ones that were rational rather than simply reflexive, and it was taking her a moment. Wesley Hartwell had told her son to ask his mother. Wesley Hartwell, the most dangerous man in the county, had told an 8-year-old boy to check with his parent before agreeing to anything. That was either extremely calculated or extremely decent, and she was not sure which. "I will think about it," she said, which was how she bought time when she had not yet decided what she thought. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and she thought about it while she made supper, corn bread and salt pork, and the last of the winter's preserved green beans. And she thought about it while Eli told her about everything else he had done that day with the enthusiastic thoroughness that was his particular genius. And what she kept coming back to, underneath all of her careful objections, was the simple fact that her son wanted to learn to whittle, and she did not know how to teach him. And Thomas had known, but Thomas was gone. And a man who had told a boy to ask his mother first was a man who, whatever else he was, had at least that one piece of decency in him. She went to the hardware store the next morning. Not to give permission, she told herself she was simply going to look at the situation and assess it, which was not precisely the same thing. She left the store in the care of Mrs. Albright, who came in 3 mornings a week, and had the kind of cheerfully unshakable presence that kept things running without any unnecessary drama. She found Wesley Hartwell exactly where Eli had said he would be, on the front steps of the hardware building in the early morning light. He had a piece of cedar wood in one hand and a folding knife in the other, and he was working at it with the slow, concentrated attention of a man who was in no hurry and had no performance to give. He was larger than she had expected from a distance. Not imposingly large, not the barrel-chested theatrical kind of large she associated with men who wanted you to be afraid of them, but solidly built in a way that suggested use rather than show. His hands were careful on the wood. He saw her before she was halfway across the street, because of course he did men like that always did, and he did not stand immediately or make any dramatic adjustment of his posture. He simply looked at her with dark eyes that were calmer than she had expected and waited. "My son tells me you offered to teach him to whittle," she said, stopping a few feet from the bottom step. "I did," he said. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that did not reach for anything. "I want to know why." He considered that with what seemed to be genuine thought rather than strategy. "He was watching me for a good 10 minutes and trying not to look like he was watching me," he said. He had questions in his face. When he finally asked what I was making, I could see he was interested in the thing itself, not just in being bold about talking to a stranger. That kind of interest deserves an answer. He is 8 years old and he does not always think before he does things, Opal said. That is fairly standard for 8, Wesley said. It was a simple observation and it was accurate and it made her feel, against her will, a small lightening of something in her chest. I run the dry goods store, she said. I am here with my son and no husband. I need to know that the people Eli spends time around are safe to be around. Something moved across his face then. Not offense exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he had expected this conversation and had decided before it began that he would not make it harder for her than it needed to be. That is a fair thing to need to know, he said. Are you safe to be around? For a child? Yes, he said simply. I have done things I am not proud of. I have been in situations that required hard choices and I made them the only way I knew how. But I have never hurt anyone who was not already trying to hurt someone else, and I have never in my life raised a hand or a weapon toward a child or a woman or anyone who could not defend themselves. That is the truest thing I can tell you about myself. She studied him for a long moment. The morning was cool and the street was still mostly quiet, and a rooster somewhere down the block was having opinions about the dawn. 1 hour, she said. I will be across the street and I will be watching. Understood, he said. She went back across the street, and at 8 o'clock sharp Eli came out of the store at a dead run and skidded to a stop in front of Wesley Hartwell's steps, breathing hard and trying to look calm, and Wesley Hartwell moved over on the step to make room and took a piece of soft pine from his coat pocket, and the lesson began. Opal watched from the store window. She watched Wesley Hartwell hand the piece of pine to Eli and then show him, with his own larger hands guiding the child's smaller ones, how to hold the knife safely. She watched him talk, and she watched Eli listen with the specific quality of attention that Eli reserved for things he actually cared about, which was a narrower category than one might hope. She watched Wesley correct Eli's grip gently, repositioning the thumb, explaining something she could not hear, and she watched Eli try again. She watched Wesley nod. She was not entirely sure what she had expected. Something more theatrical, maybe. Something that kept the danger more visible. Instead, what she got was a large, scarred, carefully dangerous man sitting on a hardware store step in the spring sunshine, teaching her son which way to cut with the grain of the wood, and the scene was so unremarkably tender that it confused her. When the hour was up, Wesley wrapped the piece of pine in a cloth and gave it to Eli to keep, and Eli ran back across the street holding it like a treasure, and told Opal everything that had been said in great and breathless detail. The next morning, Eli asked if he could go again. She said yes. She watched again. On the third morning, she did not watch from the window. She brought them both coffee for Wesley and warm milk with a scraping of sugar for Eli, and she sat on the step below them because the step had room, and she listened to Wesley explain to Eli the difference between soft pine and harder woods, and why each had its uses, and what you could make with one that you could not make with the other. "What are you going to make?" she asked Eli. "A horse," Eli said immediately. He had been thinking about it clearly. "Mr. Hartwell is helping me decide which kind of wood." "Pine for starting," Wesley said, and for the first time he looked directly at her in a way that was not assessing or careful but simply conversational, the way you looked at someone you had decided to treat as a person rather than a variable. "Pine forgives mistakes. Once he has the feel of it, he can try harder woods." "Pine forgives mistakes," she said. "That is a good philosophy." "It is a good philosophy," he agreed. She looked at her coffee. The morning was bright and the street was starting to fill with the day's commerce, horses and wagons, and the sound of the feed store opening down at the corner. "How long have you been whittling?" she asked. "Since I was about his age," Wesley said. "My father taught me. It was the one good thing he gave me." It was said plainly, without self-pity or particular bitterness, and she took it the way it was offered without pressing. "My husband knew how to whittle," she said. "He meant to teach Eli. He died before he got the chance." She had not meant to say that. It was simply there, and she said it, and then she waited to see what Wesley Hartwell would do with it. Some men, when you mentioned a dead husband, turned clumsy with it, offering condolences that were really just discomfort wearing a polite hat. Some men used it as a doorway to something else, something opportunistic that she always spotted before it fully arrived. Wesley said, "I am sorry for that loss for both of you," just that. And then he looked back at Eli's knife work and said, "Eli, you are going with the grain there, that is good, but come back a little, let the knife find the angle," and the mourning continued. She thought about that for a long time afterward, the economy of it, the respect in not making more of it than she had offered, and the warmth in acknowledging it at all. By the end of the second week, the morning whittling sessions had become a fixture, and Opal had stopped pretending she was there only to supervise. She was there because she wanted to be there, which was a different and more complicated truth that she was still in the early stages of understanding. Wesley Hartwell did not make the mistake of moving too fast. He was a man who, by the evidence of his existence, had learned the hard way that patience was not a passive quality but an active one, and he applied it here with the same care he applied to his knife work. He talked to Eli. He talked to Opal when she gave him something to talk about. He asked questions about the store, about what it had been like to build it, about which supplies came from the East and which from Wichita, and his questions were the kind that made clear he was actually interested in the answers rather than simply manufacturing conversation. On a Tuesday morning in the third week, he showed up at the front counter of her store with a busted hinge on a wooden box and asked if she had a replacement, and she did, and she found it in the back. And when she came out, he was looking at the shelves the way people look at things they are genuinely noticing rather than just seeing. "You organized this yourself?" he asked, taking the hinge. "I reorganized it, yes. Thomas had it by supplier. I changed it to category, so customers could find what they needed without needing to know where it came from." "That is smart," he said. "It was practical," she said. "Usually the same thing," he said. She charged him 2 cents for the hinge, and he paid it and said thank you and left, and she stood at the counter for a moment afterward with the particular stillness of someone who has just noticed something shifting in themselves that they had not been watching for. She was attracted to him. She recognized the feeling the way you recognize a piece of music you heard long ago, not immediately, not all at once, but in layers, one note at a time, until suddenly the whole shape of it was clear and undeniable. She spent 2 days being very sensible about this. He was a dangerous man with a complicated past and an uncertain future, and she had a child and a mortgage and a life she had built carefully from grief and stubbornness. And getting that life tangled up with a man like Wesley Hartwell was not the kind of decision a practical woman made. And then on the fourth morning she brought him coffee, and he took it with both hands around the cup, the way you hold something warm when the morning is still cold, and he looked at her over the rim of it with those calm dark eyes and said, "How are you this morning, Opal?" And it was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it was very quiet and very sincere, and all of her sensible arguments lost about a foot of altitude. "I am well," she said. "How are you?" "Better than I have been in a good while," he said, and went back to watching Eli Whittle. The horse was coming along. It was lumpy in places, and the neck was perhaps a little too short, but Eli was improving steadily, and Wesley was a patient teacher with good instincts for when to correct and when to let a child find his own way. He never made Eli feel stupid for a mistake. He reframed every wrong cut as information. "You tried this. You learned that. Now you know." Opal watched the two of them together and felt something she did not have an immediate word for. It was not grief, and it was not longing exactly, though there were elements of both. It was something more complicated and more alive, something that had to do with watching a man be genuinely good to her son, with no audience and no performance, just the simple, uncomplicated goodness of a person who had decided that an 8-year-old's interest in wood carving deserved to be taken seriously. There was a community picnic on the second Saturday of May. organized by the Ladies' Civic Association, which Opal was a member of largely because declining membership in the Ladies' Civic Association in a town the size of Caldwell was more effort than it was worth. There were tables set up in the field behind the Methodist church, and food that everyone had contributed, and children running in the grass, and the particular cheerful noise of a small community that has decided to enjoy itself. Eli found Wesley Hartwell within 10 minutes of arriving, because of course he did, and dragged him toward the table where Opal was setting out the cornbread she had made that morning. "Mr. Hartwell came," Eli announced, as if he had personally been responsible for this. Wesley stood at the edge of the table with his hat in his hands, which was a gesture of such uncomplicated courtesy that Opal felt the corner of her mouth pull upward before she could stop it. "I was invited," Wesley said, looking at Opal with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and careful uncertainty, "by this one. He lives here," Eli said reasonably. "Why would he not come to the picnic?" "Why indeed," Opal said, and she gestured at the table. "There is cornbread. I made too much." He ate the cornbread and said it was the best he had eaten in years, and when she gave him a skeptical look he said, "I am not a man who says things to make women feel good about their baking. It is genuinely excellent cornbread." And she laughed, which was something she had not done in a full-throated way in some time, and which surprised her a little with its own ease. They walked along the edge of the field while Eli ran with the other children, and they talked, and it was the longest sustained conversation they had yet had. She learned that he was from Missouri originally, that his mother had died when he was 12, that he had left home at 16 with nothing in particular, and had spent the subsequent years accumulating a reputation that he had never entirely intended. "The first time I drew on a man, I was 19, he said, looking out at the grass. He was robbing a family at a relay station outside of Independence. There were children there. I acted before I thought about it, and it turned out I was faster than I had any reason to know, and the man was not able to continue what he had been doing." A pause. "After that, things sort of accumulated." "You never wanted it," she said. "It was not a question." "I never sought it out," he said. "But I was good at it, and being good at something in a world that uses you for it does not leave a great deal of room for deciding you would rather be something else." "What would you rather be?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Something simpler," he said. "Something that did not require carrying everything I carry." He looked at her sideways. "I am in Caldwell because I am thinking about whether simpler is still possible, whether it is too late for it." She looked at the children in the grass, Eli's dark head visible among them, his laugh audible from 50 yards. "I built my store after Thomas died," she said. "Not from scratch entirely, but I changed everything about how it ran, because I needed it to be mine and not just something I was maintaining until I figured out what to do next. I was 30 years old and I felt like it was very late to be starting over." She paused. "It was not too late. Nothing I have done since has been too late." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his expression that was open in a way she had not seen in him before, as if some layer he habitually kept in place had shifted slightly. "Opal," he said. "Wesley," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the afternoon light, and then Eli came pelting across the field to tell them that Jimmy Dawson's dog had eaten someone's pie, and it was very funny, and they had to come see. And the moment broke into laughter and motion, and the ordinary beautiful noise of a spring afternoon in 1882. It was 3 days after the picnic that Opal understood with full and inconvenient clarity that she was falling in love with Wesley Hartwell, and that this was not going to be a thing she could be sensible out of. She was taking inventory, which was the kind of methodical, repetitive task that left the mind free to do whatever it wanted, and what her mind wanted to do was Wesley Hartwell. The way he held a coffee cup. The way he looked at her son, not with the performative warmth of a man trying to impress a mother, but with the genuine, uncomplicated interest of someone who found Eli interesting on his own terms. The scar on his jaw and the gray at his temples, and the fact that he was 32 years old and had seen more hard things than most men, and was still, underneath all of it, a person who told a boy to ask his mother first. She counted sugar sacks and thought about the economy of him, the way he used words carefully and meant them when he used them, the way he had said, "I am sorry for that loss," without making it about himself. She counted flour and thought about the way he had said her name at the picnic, with a kind of deliberateness that suggested he had been thinking about saying it for a while before he did. She got to the end of the flour and put down her pencil and sat on the back step of the store in the early afternoon quiet and admitted to herself, fully and without equivocation, that she wanted him. Not just his company and not just his friendship and not just the warm, competent presence of him on the hardware store steps in the morning. She wanted the whole complicated, difficult, remarkable thing of him. Having admitted it, she then had to decide what to do with it, which was harder. She did not act on it immediately. She was not the kind of person who acted on things immediately. She watched it, and she let it be there, and she went about her days. He noticed something changing, she could tell. He was a careful observer, and she was not particularly good at concealing things from people who were paying attention, which Wesley always was. His own manner shifted slightly in response, becoming a little more, she searched for the word, a little more present. He sat a little closer on the steps. He found reasons to come into the store that were not always strictly necessary. He asked after her specifically, not as a polite formality but with the quality of someone who actually wanted to know. One evening in the middle of May, he walked her home from the store. It was not planned. Eli had gone ahead with Mrs. Albright, who was taking him for supper at her house along with her own grandchildren, and Opal was locking up alone, and Wesley happened to be passing on the street with no particular urgency, and they fell into step with the naturalness of people who have found their rhythm together without quite announcing it. The evening was warm, and the sky above the Kansas prairie was doing what Kansas skies did best, which was being large and extraordinary, pink and copper at the edges, and that particular deep blue overhead that felt like falling upward into something enormous. They walked without hurrying and talked about the letter she had received from her sister in Ohio, and the report he had heard that a new hotel was planned for the north end of Main Street, and the somewhat fraught state of the town council's relationship with the cattle drovers who came up the Kishom Trail. At her door she stopped and faced him, and he stopped and faced her, and there was a moment of considerable mutual awareness. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Thank you for taking it," he said. She looked at his hands, the knife-scarred, careful hands, and then up at his face and said, "Wesley, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "Always," he said. "Are you planning to stay? In Caldwell, I mean. Or is this a temporary stop on a road that goes somewhere else?" He held her gaze with the steadiness that she had come to understand was one of the most fundamental things about him, the quality of a man who did not look away from difficult things. "I was planning to stay through the summer and then decide," he said. "That is the honest answer. 6 weeks ago that was the honest answer. It is not the complete honest answer anymore." "What is the complete honest answer?" "I am finding reasons to stay that I did not come here expecting to find," he said. "You are one of them. Eli is one of them. The feeling this town gives me of something I have been looking for without knowing I was looking is one of them." He paused. "I am not a man who makes promises lightly, which is partly why I have not yet made you any, but I want you to know that what is happening here for me is not temporary." She stood with that for a moment. The evening was quiet around them. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "It needed saying." It did. Another moment. She reached out and briefly touched the back of his hand, just the lightest press of her fingers against his knuckles, and then stepped back. "Good night, Wesley. Good night, Opal." She went inside with the warmth of that small contact still in her fingers, and stood in her front room for a moment in the dark and let herself feel entirely, and without apology, how very much she liked this man. The complication arrived, as complications always did, without sending word ahead. His name was Cullen Voss, and he rode into Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of May, and he was looking for Wesley Hartwell, and the purpose of his looking was not friendly. Opal heard about it from Mabel Doss within an hour, because this was Mabel Doss's particular gift to the town, the speed and reliability with which she distributed alarming information. Voss was a man from Wesley's past, from the years in the Texas Panhandle, and the story, as far as Mabel had assembled it from 3 different sources, was that one of the Drover brothers Wesley had faced down outside of Dodge City had been a cousin of Voss's, and Voss had been harboring a grudge about it for going on a year and a half, and had apparently decided that now was the time to pursue it. He had made his purpose known at the saloon, in terms colorful enough that 2 men had felt it necessary to relay them, and Caldwell held its breath. Opal closed her store at midday and went to find Wesley. She found him in the livery stable, checking on his horse with the unhurried attention of a man who had already been informed and was thinking it through. "I heard about Voss," she said from the stable door. He looked up from his horse's foreleg. "Word travels. This is a small town." He straightened and faced her. He looked tired, she thought. Not afraid, she did not think fear was a thing that moved through him the way it moved through other people, but tired in the way of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just felt it get heavier. "He will find me," Wesley said. "There is no point in pretending otherwise." "What are you going to do?" "Talk to him," he said. "That is the first thing. Men like Voss, sometimes talking is enough. Sometimes when they have stood in front of the thing they have been chasing, they discover it is smaller than they thought. And if talking is not enough," he looked at her steadily, "then I will handle it the way I have handled things before." "I do not want you to handle it that way," she said. The words came out with more force than she had intended, and she let them stand because they were true. "I do not want you to handle anything that way. I want you to stay." He was very still. The horse moved in the stall behind him, a soft shuffle of hooves. "Opal, I know what you are going to say, that it is not my call. That you have to face what comes for you. That this is just who you are." She crossed the distance between them and stood close enough that she could see the particular depth in his dark eyes. "But you said you are finding reasons to stay. I am telling you that I am a reason to stay. Eli is a reason. Whatever this is between us, this thing that has been building for 6 weeks on the steps of a hardware store, that is a reason to stay." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding something, could see the calculation and the feeling working against each other in the stillness of his face. "I have no intention of going anywhere," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. But I cannot walk away from a man who is going to follow me through this county hurting people who get in his way. That is not walking away from danger, Opal. That is dragging it behind me and calling it someone else's problem." She understood that. She hated it and she understood it. "Talk to him," she said. "Please." "I will talk to him," he said. He talked to Cullen Voss in the street in front of the saloon that afternoon, and she heard about it afterward from 3 different people who had been watching from the safety of their various establishments. Wesley had walked up to Voss and said something very quiet and direct, and Voss had said something loud and theatrical, and Wesley had said something else quiet and direct, and then there had been a stretch of silence that had apparently gone on long enough that even Voss's own pride had begun to look for an exit. Voss left that evening. He rode out north and was not seen again in Caldwell, and the reason he left, as near as anyone could tell, was simply this. Wesley Hartwell had looked at him and said something that Voss had decided he believed, and whatever it was, it had been more convincing than a bullet would have been. Nobody knew exactly what was said. Wesley did not volunteer it, and nobody with any wisdom asked. He came by the store that evening and leaned in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and Opal looked up from the counter where she had been doing accounts without seeing any of the numbers. "He is gone," Wesley said. She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, since midday. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I told him that his cousin threw a gun at a family of 4, and I was the only person in that relay station who was able to stop him. I told him that the most honest thing he could do with his grief was directed at the choices his cousin made rather than at the man who stopped them from ending in greater tragedy. A pause. I also told him that I was done with the kind of life that accumulates this kind of debt, and that the next person who came looking for me with that energy would find a different man than they expected. And he believed you. I believed me, Wesley said. I think that helped. She came around the counter and stood in front of him and looked up at him and said, I am glad you are here. So am I, he said, more than I can say. She reached up and touched the scar on his jaw, very gently, the way you touch something fragile and rare, and he stood very still under her hand with an expression on his face that she had not seen there before, something that was younger and more open than his usual composure, something that looked a great deal like hope. Opal, he said very quietly. I know, she said, and she did know. She knew the whole shape of it, the difficulty and the complication and the long road it would take and the profound worth of the destination. She knew all of it. He covered her hand on his jaw with his own hand and held it there for a moment, and then he pressed his lips to her palm just briefly, just gently, and she felt it all the way through her. That was the beginning of the rest of it, or rather the formalization of the beginning, because the real beginning had been on a hardware store step with a piece of pine wood and her 8-year-old son's complete confidence that interesting people deserved to be talked to. June in Caldwell was warm and golden and full of the commerce of the cattle season. The Kisham Trail bringing its noisy procession of longhorns and cowboys through the southern edge of town, with all the particular chaos and energy that entailed. Opal's store did well in the cattle season because cowboys needed supplies, and she ran a fair house that did not adjust its prices for temporary abundance, which meant that returning drovers came to her specifically and told others to do the same. Wesley spent time at the store helping with the heavier work, reloading the high shelves, shifting crates that had come in on the supply wagon, without making it a statement about anything. He asked before he helped, and he did not insert himself where he was not wanted, which she appreciated, because she had built this store herself, and she was not interested in anyone sweeping in with the assumption that she needed rescuing from it. Eli's horse was coming along beautifully. It had legs now, properly carved and separated, and a tail that had taken 3 attempts and a significant amount of coaching, and Wesley had shown him how to smooth the surface with the flat of the blade, so the wood felt like something finished rather than something in progress. Eli carried it in his pocket everywhere he went and showed it to everyone he encountered with the pride of a craftsman who knew the value of his own work. One afternoon, Eli sat on the counter of the store turning the small wooden horse in his fingers and said, with the directness that was his particular gift, "Mama, are you going to marry Mr. Hartwell?" Opal did not drop the jar of dried apricots she was shelving, which she considered a personal achievement. "That is not a question you need to be asking," she said, setting the apricots down with care. "I am asking it," Eli said. "I am allowed to ask questions." "You are," she agreed. "Do you like him?" She looked at her son, his serious 8-year-old face, the way he held the wooden horse in both hands like a small ceremony. "Yes," she said, "I like him very much." "He likes you too," Eli said. "He watches you when you are not looking, the same way Papa used to." She had to breathe through that for a moment. "You are a perceptive child," she said. "Mrs. Albright says I have old eyes," Eli said, not without satisfaction. "Mrs. Albright is not wrong," Opal said. She came around the counter and crouched in front of him. "I want you to know that whatever happens, you come first. Always. Any decision I make includes you, and your feelings about it matter to me more than you know." Eli considered this with appropriate gravity. "I like Mr. Hartwell," he said. "He does not talk to me like I am stupid. He explains things." A pause. "Papa explained things too." "Papa did," Opal said. "I think Papa would have liked him," Eli said, and then slid off the counter and ran out the front door because he had said his piece and was now done with the emotional weight of it, in the way that 8-year-olds close a conversation by simply exiting it. Opal stayed crouched on the floor for a moment. Papa would have liked him. She thought Thomas would have, actually. Thomas had been a man of clear eyes and no pretension, who valued honesty above almost everything else. And Wesley Hartwell was, at his core, the most honest person she had met in a long time. She had a conversation with Wesley that evening on the bench outside the store, in the blue dusk with the first stars coming out over the flat Kansas horizon. She told him what Eli had said, including the part about watching her the way Thomas used to, and she watched the color in Wesley's face change slightly, a warmth coming into it that had nothing to do with the season. "He is perceptive," Wesley said. "He is," she said. "And he is also 8, and he has already lost one father, and I need you to understand what that means before anything moves further between us." "I understand it," he said. "Do you? Because it is not a casual thing. If this becomes what it is starting to feel like it wants to be, it is not just about you and me. It is about him. It is about what he builds with you and what it does to him if that gets taken away." Wesley turned to face her fully, and his expression was the most serious she had seen it. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I told you that. But you need something more than my word, and I understand that too, so let me be as clear as I know how to be. I have been living my life for 16 years as a man who belongs nowhere in particular, and I have not minded it until recently. What I have found here with you and with that boy is the first thing in all those years that has felt like it could be a place, a real place, the kind you choose and stay in. I'm not saying this to make you feel comfortable. I am saying it because it is true and you deserve the truth." She looked at him for a long time. "All right," she said. "All right. All right, Wesley." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the bench in the Kansas dusk holding hands with the cattle season sounds of the town around them, and it was the simplest and most complete moment she had had in years. July brought the heat that the Kansas summer did not apologize for, the kind of heat that sat on the town like a hand, and made everyone slower and shorter-tempered, and considerably more prone to sitting in the shade with cold water. Opal's store moved quantities of salt for preservation and cloth for light summer clothing, and she stayed late most evenings doing the accounts in the relative cool. Wesley came by late one Tuesday evening and found her at the back desk, and brought her cold water from the well, and sat across from her while she worked, and they talked about the things a man and a woman talk about when they have passed through the careful conversational stages and arrived somewhere more honest. They talked about their fears, which for Opal was losing Eli in any form, to illness or accident or the simple eventual departure of a grown child into his own life, and for Wesley was becoming a man who had wasted the second half of his life the way he felt he had wasted the first. They talked about what they wanted, and the things they wanted were, it turned out, not so dissimilar ground and purpose, and people who were worth staying for. He kissed her for the first time that evening, or she kissed him, or perhaps it was accurately described as simultaneous, as those things often are when they have been arriving for some time. She had been reaching for the water glass, and he had been reaching to pass it to her, and their hands had met, and the meeting had paused them, and then something in the space between them had simply closed, and his mouth was on hers, and it was warm and careful and exactly as certain as she had thought it would be. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him, breathing slightly differently than she had been before. "I have been thinking about doing that," she admitted. "How long?" he said, not quite a question. "A while," she said, "since the picnic, honestly." "I have been thinking about it since about the third morning on the steps," he said. "When you brought the coffee," she laughed. She pressed her forehead briefly to his shoulder, just briefly, and then straightened, because they were in her store and she was a woman of a certain dignity, and also because if she did not put some air between them she was going to kiss him again. "We should be careful," she said. "We should be careful," he agreed. "For Eli's sake." "Agreed." "Not because I want to be," she said. He smiled at that, and it was the most unguarded smile she had seen on his face, the kind of smile that belonged to the person underneath all the years of careful hardness, and it made her feel, helplessly and completely, that she was in exactly the right place. She told Eli carefully and at the right moment, choosing a Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the porch, and Eli was working on his horse with the knife Wesley had given him, a small folding blade with a carved handle that Eli treated with the reverence appropriate to a sacred object. She said, "Eli, you know that Mr. Hartwell and I have been spending time together." Eli did not look up from his carving. "I know," he said. "I want you to know that it has become something important to me, that he is someone important to me." Eli looked up then. "Are you going to get married?" he asked, with the efficiency of a child who has no interest in the circumlocutionary approach. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "What I know is that I care about him and he cares about me, and whatever happens between us, you will be part of that decision. Do you understand?" Eli thought about it. "Can I still have whittling lessons?" She stared at him for a moment and then laughed, and it came out bigger than she expected, and Eli started laughing too. "Yes," she said, "you can still have whittling lessons." "Good," Eli said, and went back to his horse with the satisfied air of a negotiation concluded. She went to find Wesley and told him about this exchange, and he laughed, a real and genuine laugh that she was beginning to collect in her memory the way she collected other things she wanted to keep, and said, "That boy has his priorities extremely well organized." "He comes by it honestly," she said. Wesley looked at her with that unguarded warmth. "I know he does." In August, the formal courtship became something that the town of Caldwell acknowledged openly, which in a town the size of Caldwell meant that it was discussed extensively and publicly, as all significant events were. Most of the reaction was more positive than Opal had expected. The majority of the town had, it emerged, formed the opinion that Wesley Hartwell had either turned a corner or had never been quite as purely dangerous as his reputation suggested, and the sight of him teaching an 8-year-old to whittle had done considerable work in the direction of both conclusions. There were a few who disapproved, the people who felt that a widow with a child could do better, or that a man with his past was not one to build a future on. She heard these opinions at a remove, through the dependable medium of Mabel Doss, and she received them with the equanimity of a woman who had made up her mind. Her own doubts were not about Wesley. They were about herself, about whether she was ready to choose again, about whether love the second time around was the same animal as the first or something new and different that required new and different navigation. She had loved Thomas honestly and completely, and losing him had left a scar that had healed but was permanent, and she was not sure sometimes whether she was loving Wesley or reaching toward him, because loss had taught her that you only ever have the time you have, and she did not want to waste it. She talked to him about this one evening with the directness that she valued in him and tried to practice herself. "I want to be honest about something," she said. "Please," he said. "Sometimes I am not sure if I am falling in love with you or if I am reaching for something that fills the space Thomas left, and I want you to know that I think about that, and I want you to know that I do not think it is the same thing, but I am not always certain." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you think those two things are necessarily separate?" She looked at him. "Thomas was your husband and your partner and the father of your son, and you loved him and you lost him," Wesley said. That made a space. The space is real, but the person who fills it, if anyone ever fills it because of who they are, not because of what shape the space is. The question you are really asking is whether I am the right person, and I cannot answer that for you. All I can tell you is that I am not interested in filling a space. I am interested in you, in the actual specific real person that you are, with your store and your son and your cornbread and the way you count dried beans like everyone matters." She stared at him. "You notice that?" "I notice everything about you," he said simply. She sat with that for a long time, and what she arrived at, when she had looked at it from enough angles, was that this thing between them was its own complete thing. Not a substitute for Thomas, not a recovery from Thomas, but something new and real and entirely itself. And that was good. That was right. On the first day of September, Wesley Hartwell rode out to the land office in the county seat and filed a claim on 40 acres of good grassland 3 miles east of Caldwell, with water access and enough timber to justify the lumber he would need to build a house. He came back and told Opal about it that evening, not as a surprise but as a conversation, laying out what he had done and what he was thinking and asking, carefully, what she thought. She thought it was the most hopeful thing she had ever heard. She thought it was the clearest possible statement a man could make about whether he was planning to stay. She thought, standing in the evening light in her store with the accounts spread on the desk between them, that she was very much in love with this man, and that this was not grief and not space-filling and not caution overruled by loneliness, but the simple, vast, and specific fact of wanting this particular, complicated, remarkable person in her life for all the time there was. "Wesley," she said. "I know I have not asked you anything formally yet," he said. "I'm not asking right now, either. Not until the house is standing and I have something real to offer that is not just words and intentions. But I want you to know the direction I am moving." "I know the direction you are moving," she said. "And," she looked at him across the desk, across the accounts, across the accumulated distance of 6 months that had begun on a hardware store step with a piece of pine wood and an 8-year-old's confidence that interesting people were worth talking to. "The direction is good," she said. "Keep moving in it." He began building in October, when the brutal summer heat had finally relented and the prairie was settling into the golden cool of fall. He was not building alone. He had hired 2 men from town, brothers named Reed and Samuel Aldicott, who were good carpenters and decent people, and the 3 of them worked 5 days a week with the steady, purposeful energy of men who had a clear vision and a deadline. Opal rode out on Sundays with Eli in the wagon, and they would eat lunch in the open air with the half-finished structure rising around them. And Eli would run through the skeleton of rooms calling out which one would be his and which would be the kitchen, with the proprietary confidence of a child who has been consulted and therefore considers himself a stakeholder. Wesley showed Eli the joinery on the window frames, how the wood fit together without nails at the corners, and Eli absorbed this with the focused intensity that he brought to all of Wesley's instruction, because he had understood very early that Wesley taught things that were real and could be used, and that the using of them was where the value lived. On the 3rd Sunday, while Reed and Samuel were in town, Wesley took Opal through the framed-out rooms and showed her where everything would go. The kitchen along the south wall for the afternoon sun, the main room wide enough for a table where people could gather. 3 bedrooms across the back, which was more than he technically needed for one man and which he noted with a careful sideways look at her and said nothing. She traced her hand along a window frame, feeling the joined wood smooth under her fingers. "You are good at this," she said. "Building." "I am learning," he said. "I am better at tearing things apart than putting them together, but I am learning." She turned and looked at him, the October sky vast and pale blue through the open wall behind him. "You are better at putting things together than you think," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the unfinished room and took her face in his hands and kissed her with the full and unhurried certainty of a man who has arrived somewhere he intends to stay. And she put her arms around him and kissed him back with equal certainty. And the unfinished house stood around them in the autumn light, full of the specific promise of a thing not yet done but clearly, undeniably becoming real. Eli appeared in the doorway a moment later and made a sound that was approximately a theatrical clearing of the throat, and they separated, and Opal covered her mouth to hide her smile, and Wesley looked at Eli with an expression of perfect composure that was somewhat undermined by the warmth in his face. "I found a good room for whittling," Eli announced. "It has a window that faces east. Morning light is good for seeing the grain." "That is exactly right," Wesley said. "Morning light is the best for it." Eli looked between the 2 of them with those perceptive old-eyed eyes. "Good," he said, and disappeared. November brought the first cold, and the house came together with the particular speed of a structure whose bones were already in, and whose completion was just the patient work of filling in. Wesley moved out of his room above the hardware store and into the house before it was fully finished, sleeping on a cot in the main room with the kitchen still not plastered, because he was impatient in the way that a man becomes impatient when he has decided on a thing, and is now just waiting for logistics to catch up to intention. Opal visited on a Sunday in mid-November and brought with her a pie, a dried apple and cinnamon pie that filled the new house with a smell so right and so domestic that both of them stood in the kitchen for a moment in the kind of charged silence that says more than speech. "Wesley," she said. He turned from the pie to look at her. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her with those calm dark eyes and something in them that was entirely alive. "I was going to wait until the house was finished," he said. "I know," she said. "Ask me anyway." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and took both her hands in his, the careful scarred hands that had done hard things and now did gentle things, and he looked at her with the full weight of everything he was and everything he had been and everything he was trying to become, and he said, "Opal Keene, I spent 16 years being a man I did not entirely want to be, in a life I did not entirely choose, and I had made my peace with the idea that it was simply what there was for me. And then I came here to this town, and sat on those steps and talked to your son, and sat across from you on a hardware store step in the morning light, and I understood what it felt like to want a life you had actually chosen instead of the one that accumulated around you by default. I want to choose this. I want to choose you and Eli and this house and this town and the whole long good rest of whatever time there is. Will you marry me?" She had been holding the edge of the answer for weeks, saving it for this, and now she let it go. "Yes," she said, "I will." He squeezed her hands and closed his eyes for just a moment, and she could see him breathing through it, through the enormity of getting a thing you had wanted and been afraid to fully want. And then he opened his eyes and she was still there, and he smiled, and it was the full and unguarded smile she loved most, the one that belonged to the person beneath all the years of hardness. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the kitchen smelled of apple pie and pine lumber and new plaster, and it was just about the most perfect thing she had ever smelled. Eli took the news with the equanimity of a person who had seen it coming and was simply relieved that the adults had finally caught up to the obvious conclusion. He said, "So Mr. Hartwell is going to be my father," with the inflection of a man making a note in a ledger. "He is going to be your stepfather," Opal said carefully. "Your father was Thomas Keene, and nothing changes that." Eli thought about this. "Can I call him Papa?" It was Opal's turn to breathe through something for a moment. She looked at Wesley, who was looking at Eli with an expression she could not quite read because it was too many things at once. "You can call him whatever feels right," Opal said. "And you and Mr. Hartwell can talk about it together." Eli looked at Wesley. "Does Papa feel right to you?" Wesley crouched down so he was at Eli's eye level, and his voice was steady even though nothing else about him was entirely steady right then. "It would be one of the greatest honors of my life," he said. Eli nodded, satisfied, and held up his wooden horse. "I need you to help me fix the ear," he said. "I cut it too thin and I'm afraid it will break." "I can do that," Wesley said. They married in December, on a clear, cold Saturday morning in the Methodist church, with Eli standing beside Wesley as a solemn small witness, wearing a shirt Opal had pressed twice to be sure, and holding the wooden horse in his left hand because it was his and he went nowhere without it. Mabel Doss cried with the enthusiastic commitment of a woman who had orchestrated none of this and was therefore free to enjoy it entirely. Mrs. Albright wore a hat with an ambitious amount of ribbon. Reed and Samuel Aldicott sat in the third pew and looked pleased in the way of men who have built something for people and are glad to see those people happy in it. Wesley wore a dark coat he had bought new for the occasion and had his boots polished to a degree that suggested genuine effort. And when Opal came down the aisle toward him in her best dress, a deep green wool that she had made herself, and which she had never yet worn because she had been saving it without knowing for what, He looked at her with the kind of direct and total attention that required nothing else in the room. She had thought, sometimes, about how she would feel at this moment. She had wondered whether Thomas would be present in it as grief, or as a shadow, or as something else. What she found, walking down the aisle in the December light, was that Thomas was present as a warmth, a blessing, the way the people we have loved and lost come to the moments that matter as something given rather than taken. She felt his absence, and she felt his presence, and she felt the rightness of still being here, still moving forward, still willing to love in the full knowledge of what it cost. She arrived at Wesley's side, and he took her hand and looked at her with those dark, certain eyes, and she thought, "This is the right thing. This is the exactly right thing," and was entirely sure of it. They said their words to each other, and the minister said his words over them, and outside the church in the thin December sunlight the town of Caldwell went about its Saturday business, and somewhere down the street a dog was having an argument with a post, and in the middle of all of it Opal Keene became Opal Hartwell, and Wesley Hartwell became a man with a family. And Eli got the papa he had identified as necessary and negotiated for, with the strategic acumen of a child who understood what he wanted and was not afraid to say so. The house was finished in January, fully finished, plaster and all, and they moved in together on a cold, bright day with the wagon loaded with Opal's things, the things she had carried through 2 years of widowhood and careful management. And as each item came into the new house, it seemed to change its nature slightly, to become not a remnant of the past but a piece of the present, finding its new place in a new architecture. Wesley hung Thomas Keene's portrait, a small daguerreotype in a wooden frame, in the main room without being asked, because he had simply understood that it belonged there, that Eli's father was part of this family even now, that making room for the dead was not a betrayal of the living, but a mark of the kind of man who understood love to be something that does not diminish by being divided. When Opal saw the portrait on the wall, she stood in front of it for a long moment, and then she went and found Wesley in the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind, and held on, and he covered her hands with his own and said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. Spring came back to Caldwell in 1883 with the same generosity it always did on the Kansas prairie, all green and gold and the smell of wet earth warming. The store was running well. The house was well established. Eli had been enrolled properly in school and was performing well by all accounts, though his teacher, Miss Perkins, reported that he had a tendency to whittle small animals during arithmetic, which was a problem that Wesley handled by setting a strict rule about knives in school buildings, while also, privately, being impressed that Eli was good enough now to produce recognizable shapes without looking. On a morning in April, Opal told Wesley she was expecting. She told him simply and directly, the way she did everything, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the south windows, and watched his face go through something that was beyond expression and simply had to be lived through. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at her with eyes that were entirely bright. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "I am feeling fine. I am happy." "I am happy," he said, and it was the simplest statement and the most completely true one she had ever heard him make. He stood up and came to her and held her with the careful fullness of a man holding something he cannot quite believe is real, and she let herself be held, because she had learned by now that being held by Wesley Hartwell was one of the finest things in her considerable experience. Eli, when told, went immediately and with zero preamble into practical mode. "I am going to teach the baby to whittle," he announced, "when they are old enough." "That is a good plan," Wesley said. "They will need to start with pine," Eli said seriously. "Pine forgives mistakes." "It does," Wesley agreed. And over Eli's head he looked at Opal with those dark eyes full of warmth, and she looked back at him, and between them was the whole history of how they had arrived here. The hardware store steps, and the whittling lessons, and the coffee in the morning, and the evening walks, and the kisses in the kitchen, and the winter wedding, and the portrait on the wall, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days. And it was exactly, precisely, completely enough. The baby came in November, a boy, born at home with the doctor and Mrs. Albright both present, and a November storm rattling the new house's windows, arriving as if he had been waiting for exactly the right dramatic moment. He was red-faced and loud and had a shock of dark hair in Wesley's eyes, and they named him Thomas Wesley Hartwell, Thomas for the man who had first built this family, and Wesley for the man who was building it further, and neither of them felt this was sentimental. It felt accurate. It felt right. Eli stood at the edge of the bedroom holding his wooden horse and looking at his brother with the gravity of a person who has just understood that the world has permanently shifted. "He is very small," Eli said. "He will get bigger," Opal said, from where she lay propped against the pillows, tired in a way that was also entirely euphoric. "I will protect him," Eli said, with such solemn certainty that both Opal and Wesley looked at him at the same time with the specific expression parents wear when a child has just revealed a piece of their heart. "I know you will," Wesley said. His voice was rough in a way he did not try to smooth. "You are already an excellent older brother, and I am very proud of you." Eli squared his shoulders slightly and nodded and then said, "Can I hold him?" They settled Eli on the chair beside the bed with Thomas Wesley wrapped in his arms, and Eli sat very still, looking down at the red sleeping face with the horse clutched in one hand and his brother in the other, and it was the most peaceful thing Wesley had ever seen in his life. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his wife resting against the pillows with her eyes half closed and still smiling, his son holding his younger brother with the gravity of a child who understood the weight of something precious. And outside the storm was passing, and the stars were coming out over the Kansas prairie. And he thought about 16 years of roads and dust, and the kind of hardness that becomes habit. And he thought about a hardware store step, and a piece of pine wood, and a small boy who had looked at him with no fear whatsoever, and asked him to share what he knew. He thought about Opal coming across the street in the morning light with her careful questions, her clear eyes, her complete unwillingness to be easy about any of this, and her complete willingness to step into it anyway once she had looked at it honestly. He thought about the word home, which he had not used in 20 years with any genuine meaning, and he thought that it meant this. Specifically this. The bedroom and the storm and the sleeping baby and the careful boy and his wife's half-smile in the lamplight. He had been considered the most dangerous man in the county. He had been called that, and it had been true in its way, and he had lived inside that truth for so long that he had stopped seeing past it. And then a boy had asked him to share something simple and good, and he had said yes, because some invitations arrive at exactly the right moment, and you know them by the particular feeling of a door opening. He was 33 years old. He had a wife and 2 sons and 40 acres of Kansas grassland, and a house he had built with his own hands, and a store across the counter of which he sometimes helped his wife count dried beans with the care she gave to every ounce that mattered. He had, against every reasonable expectation, become exactly the simpler thing he had hoped might still be possible. He went and sat beside Opal on the bed, and she leaned against him without opening her eyes, and his son looked up at him over the baby's sleeping head. "Papa," Eli said softly, so as not to wake Thomas. "Yes, he has your eyes." "He does," Wesley said. "Is that all right with you?" Eli considered the baby's face with the thoroughness of an evaluator. "It is good eyes," he decided finally. "They look like they pay attention." Wesley pressed his lips to the top of Opal's head. She made a small sound of contentment that he felt all the way through him. "They do," he said. "They pay attention." The years settled in around them like the prairie settling after a season, not with the drama of arrival, but with the deeper satisfaction of permanence. The town of Caldwell grew and changed as towns do, the cattle trade shifting and adjusting with the decade, new businesses opening and old ones closing, the constant low-level drama of a frontier community finding its shape. Opal's store became one of the town's anchors, known for its fair prices and its reliable stock, and its proprietress, who people trusted because she had proven consistently over years that she meant what she said and said what she meant. Wesley found his place in the community gradually and honestly, not by argument or performance, but by being present and reliable in the ways that mattered. He helped neighbors whose cattle got through fences and whose wells needed repairing. He sat on the town council starting in 1884, in a capacity that had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with the kind of steady judgment that comes from having seen a great deal of life and thought about most of it. The reputation that had preceded him to Caldwell did not disappear. A man's history does not simply dissolve because he has decided to stop living inside it, but it softened over time into something the town held with more complexity than simple fear, more like a weather system they had learned to read and had found, on closer inspection, to be considerably less threatening than advertised. He whittled on Sunday mornings. He had been doing it for 20 years, and he continued to do it with the same slow attention, working at cedar and pine, and occasionally the harder woods when he felt like the challenge. Eli kept up his own practice with the dedication of a true student, and by the time he was 12, he was producing pieces of genuine quality, small animals and figures with detail and character that Wesley displayed around the house with unconcealed pride. Thomas grew from a red-faced November baby into a round-faced, enormously cheerful toddler, and then into a curious and energetic child who was, in temperament, entirely his own person, less reserved than Wesley, less precisely organized than Opal, with a gift for finding every breakable thing within a given radius and an apparently inexhaustible enthusiasm for the outdoors. By the spring of 1885, when Thomas was a year and a half and fully committed to walking in whatever direction seemed most alarming, Opal found herself expecting again. She told Wesley in the kitchen in the morning again, standing in the same south-facing light, and he looked at her with the same bright eyes, different this time only in that there was less overwhelm and more settled happiness, the kind of joy that knows itself. This time it was a girl, born the following winter with considerably less drama than Thomas had managed, arriving in the early morning with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had places to be. She had Opal's dark eyes and Wesley's jaw, and a disposition from the first that suggested she was going to form opinions early and hold them firmly. They named her Louisa Mee Hartwell. Eli, at 12, regarded his sister with the complex dignity of a boy who had been an older brother for 2 years and was now running a more complicated sibling portfolio. Thomas, at 1, regarded her with the frank territorial suspicion of a child displaced from his position as the baby, which lasted approximately 3 days before he decided she was interesting enough to forgive. Wesley held Louisa in the lamplight the first night, this small particular person who was fully and completely herself, and thought that he had somehow received more than a man with his history had any right to expect, and that the appropriate response to that was not guilt but gratitude, the kind that you spend every remaining day being worthy of. Opal watched him with their daughter and felt what she always felt when she watched him with their children, which was the deep, uncomplicated rightness of a choice made clearly and well. She had been afraid to choose again. She had been afraid of loss, of loving and being left again, of the specific vulnerability of caring about someone as completely as she cared about this man. And she had chosen anyway, because love is not the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward in spite of it, and she was grateful down to the marrow of her that she had. The years made their accumulation. The store expanded in 1886, a new room built onto the east side that gave them space for the dry goods that had been crowding the back corners. Wesley built it with his own hands on the evenings and weekends, Eli helping with the framing now that he was old enough to be genuinely useful, and the addition went up with the kind of solid permanence that suggested both of them took the work seriously. Thomas learned to whittle at 7, following the exact pedagogical approach his brother had received, starting with pine and working slowly toward meaning. He had less patience than Eli and more humor, and his early pieces were more impressionistic than representational, but he kept at it because Wesley kept at it with him, and eventually he produced a fish, or what was unambiguously meant to be a fish, that sat on the kitchen windowsill and was admired without irony. Louisa at 4 announced her intention to also whittle, and did not accept the explanation that she should wait until she was older, and so Wesley found her a piece of the softest pine he could source and a very small knife, and supervised with the combined attention of a man who had taught whittling to 2 boys, and was now discovering that this child had a completely different approach, faster and more intuitive, and less interested in following the grain in the conventional way. She was by 7, producing things that had a natural flowing quality the boys had not found until older, and Wesley looked at her work with the satisfaction of a teacher who has had his ideas about methodology usefully complicated. Opal watched all of this from the store counter and the kitchen table and the porch on summer evenings, and she felt time moving through the family the way it was supposed to move, not as loss but as accumulation, not as departure but as arrival, each year adding to rather than subtracting from the particular fullness of the life they had built. On a September evening in 1889, 7 years after Wesley Hartwell had ridden into Caldwell on his gray horse, with 3 men stepping off the boardwalk to give him room, Opal and Wesley sat on the porch of their house in the long golden light and listened to the sounds of their children inside. Eli at 15 helping Louisa with reading, Thomas at 7 arguing with both of them about something that sounded important to Thomas. Wesley had his knife and a piece of cedar, working at it with the same slow certainty he had always had. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, watching the prairie in the evening. "Do you know what Eli told me the other day?" she said. "What did he tell you?" "He said he is thinking of studying law when he is older. He said he wants to understand how things are supposed to work so he can help when they do not." Wesley was quiet for a moment, the knife moving through the cedar with its careful precision. "That sounds like him," he said finally. "It does," she said. "He said you told him once that knowing the rules matters because you cannot know when following them is brave until you understand when breaking them would be easier." "I did say something like that," he said. "It was good advice. He was a good student." She lifted her head and looked at him sideways, this man with the gray at his temples that had spread a little further over 7 years, the scar still pale on his jaw, the hand still careful and used, the eyes still the calmest and most present she had ever known. "I want to say something," she said. He lowered the cedar piece and looked at her, giving her his full attention in the way that was entirely his. "7 years ago you sat on the steps of a hardware store and my 8-year-old son walked up and asked you to teach him something," she said. "And you said yes, and you told him to ask his mother first. And I want you to know that I have thought about that probably more times than I have thought about almost anything, because it was the first piece of you I ever had, and it was the truest possible piece. A man who makes time for a child's curiosity and tells that child to respect his mother is telling you everything you need to know about who he is." Wesley looked at her, and the evening light was in his face, and she could see all of it, all the years, all the choosing, all the staying. "I did not know any of this was going to happen," he said. "That morning on the steps, I had no design on anything. I just thought a boy with questions in his face deserved an answer." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it meant what it meant." He put the cedar down and put his arm around her, and she settled back against his shoulder. "Opal," he said. "Wesley," she said. From inside the house, Louisa's voice rose in a declaration about something, and Thomas's voice rose in response, and Eli's voice came in between them with the authority of a 15-year-old who had decided he was the family's managing partner. The prairie stretched out ahead of them in the last September gold, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way it always was, the way it would always be. She felt Wesley press his lips to the top of her head, the way he had done for 7 years, the simple private gesture of a man saying, "You are here and I am here, and this is the thing I chose." She closed her eyes and let the evening be what it was, the sounds of her children and the smell of cedar shavings and the steady warmth of the man beside her, the whole large, ordinary, extraordinary life of it. The most dangerous man in the county. Her son had seen past that on the very first morning, with the clear sight of a child, who was not yet fluent in all the ways adults teach themselves to be afraid of the wrong things. He had looked at a scarred and careful man with a knife and a piece of wood, and seen what was actually there, which was someone worth knowing, someone with something worth learning, someone who would say yes to the small and real request of a curious 8-year-old. And that yes had been the door. And they had all walked through it together. And on the other side was this, precisely this, the house Wesley had built with his hands, and the store Opal ran with precision and purpose. The 3 children who were entirely themselves and entirely theirs. The whittled wooden horse that still sat on the kitchen windowsill next to Thomas's fish and Louis's flowing abstract cedar shape. And the 2 of them on the porch in the September evening. Together in the full and settled certainty of people who have found what they were looking for and have the wisdom and the will to keep it. This was simpler than what he had been. This was better than what he had feared was still possible. This was, in every way that mattered, exactly and irreversibly and gratefully home.